if then somebody gets back to you and says, oh, can we change that? You're not saying, oh, I don't really know if we change that and what the consequences are. So you need to understand your own contract. This is the most important thing if you're using a template. Even if you're using a template, you should understand your template.
Hey Hatchlings, welcome to the Motion Hatch podcast. I'm your host, Hayley Akins. Today's show is part 2 with our guest Silvia Baumgart. So if you haven't listened to part 1, please go back and listen to that. In this episode, we dug a little bit deeper into contracts and copyright, and we discussed how there wasn't a ton of resources available for animators and motion designers. Now, we know that dealing with contracts can be pretty scary and also quite expensive. So Silvia and I have been working on a freelance contract bundle specifically made for animators and motion designers. So if you want to hear more about when that's going to be released over the next few weeks, go to motionhatch.com/contract and sign up there, and you will get notified when it's available, and you'll also receive 10% off as well. I'm also working on a US version of the contract, so if you sign up there, you'll find out about that one as well. Now, just a little disclaimer before we get into the podcast. This podcast is for general use only and discusses the legal position in the UK at the time of publication, unless stated otherwise. You must take legal advice and not rely on the information provided in this podcast before taking action. We do not update our podcasts, and therefore past podcasts may not reflect the current legal position. So, going through this and kind of realizing that we should probably all have a contract in place, what kind of resources are out there? And should we be amending templates, or do you think it's better to talk to a lawyer or go somewhere like the Association of Illustrators? What do you recommend in terms of that?
So I know the Association of Illustrators because I worked on that. They have standard terms and conditions, a commissioning contract for illustrators. This might not be enough for animators, but it's a good starting point. It makes clear, what should be in the contract. I'm not quite sure because I haven't seen it for quite a while, how it looks like. I'm not sure if there's a cancellation policy in there, and also, what happens with the original files, which I think should be in there. But because they are currently working on improving the resources for animators, I'm sure there will be also a standard terms and conditions for animators. The most important thing is, if you're using such a template, that you yourself know exactly what it means. So it's not enough to just have a template. You have to understand your own template. So in order to know why certain clauses are there, what they mean, because if then somebody gets back to you and says, oh, can we change that? You're not saying, oh, I don't really know if we change that and what the consequences are. So you need to understand your own contract. This is the most important thing if you're using a template. Even if you're using a template, you should understand your template.
Yeah.
I think for the simple jobs, although animation is probably much more complex in some aspects than illustration, it depends a bit on the context of what you're doing. If you are, animating regularly small animations for advertising agencies, then I guess a simple standard terms and conditions would be enough because it's a temporary use. Nobody will suggest that you're creating a character which maybe might be used for branding, although maybe that is also a case. If you are creating a character for branding, like Ronald McDonald for McDonald's, this is a very successful character, then be aware that this is worth a lot of money. And if you then give away the rights in the character, which actually, if it's a brand, even if you don't have a contract, there's always the implication that you actually have given it away if you were aware that this is brand character. So obviously, speaking from a solicitor's point of view, I would always recommend that you seek professional legal advice. On the other hand, I know that money is normally tight, that you would do that on a regular basis. But if you have a job which could be very lucrative in the future, so for example, a job where that involves an animation which could become a feature film or even, a short film which is widely distributed, this is something where you should seek professional legal advice, because that might involve a distribution contract and a production company. So this is a big job, and then it depends on the royalties. In this case, I would always seek, to have a conversation with a lawyer, because that is, even 2% more in royalties, and how it's worded, the contract, can make a huge difference on how much you get in the end. So it's all about money, it's not just about intellectual property rights. It's so important how the contract is worded. And also these big production companies, they have their own legal teams. And if you are negotiating on your own, I'm not sure how far you get in order to really protect your position without a lawyer. On the other hand, the Association of Illustrators is very good in, giving this kind of basic idea of what it is about, what should be in a contract. And as they are developing, the resources for animators, I think it's really a place to go if you are an animator in the future. And the more animators join, the better the resources will be. And there's always strength in numbers, especially when you're working on your own.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great advice. So I think generally, you should have like a terms and conditions, and, whether you get that kind of base from the Association of Illustrators or elsewhere, or maybe like seek, a solicitor out or a lawyer to kind of look at one the first time and then kind of use that over and over again for your clients. But then if there's like a bigger job where you're like, this could be something where I need a bit more help, then I think maybe kind of seek out some more professional advice then. I think that's quite good advice, really.
Yeah, I can also add that most law firms, and we included, we would always, if somebody sends us an inquiry and to review a contract, we would do that at a very reasonable fee. We would then, for example, just review the contract and say, this is fine to use, and may not even, charge a lot or nothing. It depends a bit on the circumstances. But we would always try to keep the fee for something like that very low. And I would actually recommend that, especially when it's standard terms and conditions, and you will use that, not just once, but as a standard, you should get that right. And then you can go on, exactly what it means. You can talk, to the solicitor once, and then you're off and do it on your own.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I think, hopefully everyone listening to this feels a bit more confident about that they can go out and get help instead of just trying to like do it all on their own and not really know what they're doing as well. So that's really good.
Yeah, one clause I actually forgot to mention, which I think is also quite important in your contract, is moral rights. So we have spoken about the economic rights, right to copy, right to produce derivative works, right to distribute the work. But there's also moral rights, and this is the right to be credited as the author of the work. That is a right which cannot be assigned. So nobody can actually take away that you are the author of the work. But in the contract, especially when it is an assignment or an exclusive license, perpetual, and so quite where you give away a lot of control over your work, you need to be aware that there should be a clause in your contract which says either you assert your right to be credited as the author, or you waive your right to be credited as the author. And that depends on the circumstances. If it's a commercial advertisement, you're probably asked to waive your rights, but it depends a bit how well known you are. Some people are very happy to associate, the advertising campaign with a particular animator if this animator is very well known or this illustrator is very well known, because then it becomes like a brand alignment, yeah? Sometimes if you are not very well known and you're just doing a job, you're very likely asked to waive your right to be credited. And then there's also moral rights also means that you have the right to object to derogatory treatment, because it protects your integrity as a creator and author. So if somebody completely messes up your animation and you can't recognize your style anymore, or your, what you wanted to do and your artistic integrity, and they still associate your name with this particular work, but they absolutely did not, or kind of edited it in a way which is really destroying the work, then you have a right to object to that. So that's just what I wanted to mention. Some commissioners will insist that there is a clause in the contract which absolutely prevents you from objecting to anything they do with the work, but you have to know what kind of consequences that has on your integrity as an artist, and it depends on the job, really,
Yeah, I think that's really good. And one thing that I thought kind of relates to that I hear about a lot is because as animators we make short little GIFs and normally like kind of personal things, little personal projects. And then I see a lot of times people's work gets shared around the internet and they're not necessarily credited by like whoever's sharing it, right? So like people have started putting like their names on the bottom and kind of little watermarks and stuff. Do you think that's a good idea? Do we have I guess we have the right to ask people to take it down or whatever if we didn't want to, but sometimes it's difficult. I just wanted to know what you thought about that kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's a question I was asked very often by the students as well. First of all, as a principle, I would say that being on the internet and work being shared is a very good thing because it's a way of marketing. But obviously, if you want to share work, then the whole idea of sharing is that people, you want to create a name for yourself. You want people to commission you. You put your work out there for professional reasons. You're not an amateur who just does it for fun. Yeah, you want to make money. Therefore, if you put work out there, people should be able to find your contact details to commission you. That's the whole principle of doing it. So you're not creating things just because you're bored at home. You want to make money. So, and for that, people need to find your work and they need to find your website, a telephone number, an email address. So the principle when you put stuff out there is that you try to not get your work disconnected from you, your name, your contact details. However you do that, and you could embed, your website in the image if you wanted to. Many people do that now. If you put something out on Creative Commons, the license says, or most licenses says, you have to credit me so that you can find me. So the license always, requires people to credit the author, even if you put something out on Creative Commons, depending on what license you choose. But most licenses have, this kind of attribution license, even if it's for non-commercial purposes only, or even for commercial purposes. It needs to be attributed to you. So that's important to know. And if people don't do that, even under a Creative Commons license, they infringe your copyright, and they infringe the license under which you have made this work available. People should, as a matter of courtesy, cite and credit the author. But you should also try to make that as easy as possible for people if you share work on Facebook or whatever, so that they cannot, without effort, get rid of your identification in the image.
Yeah, so you think maybe putting your logo or your name or something in the bottom corner might be a good idea, because then I guess it's always going to be there unless someone makes the effort to Photoshop it out, which they probably wouldn't be doing.
Yeah, you should do that. I mean, people still do it, but then they know that they do something wrong. Yeah, there's quite a lot of effort to get rid of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's good advice as well. So when we're using something from a third party, do we always need to get permission? The most regular example that I see of this, I guess, is when people use music for their showreel and they just credit the artist.
If you're using music for a showreel, obviously, if you credit the artist, that's a big step on maybe not treading on their toes, although it is not enough in principle. So you should always ask for permission to use the music for your showreel, unless the music is made available, for example, under a Creative Commons license, which might include, commercial purposes, because ultimately a showreel is for commercial purposes. You're not creating a showreel just for fun. You're creating a showreel because you want to sell and market your work. So arguable, this is a commercial purpose for which the musician, the performers, and the composer of the music should get paid. There are other examples. For example, if you use photo work, photography in your animation, and I've seen that, you should ask the photographer for permission, especially when you then use the photography for an animation which is for commercial purposes. So you can get really, really in difficulties if you use anything in a commercial which is not cleared, where you have not cleared the rights. Because if you work for a big advertising company, for example, they sometimes put in your contract something like an indemnity clause, whereby you promise to indemnify them for any claims of third parties for intellectual property infringement, which means that instead, they get sued by the third party, say by the photographer, and then they ask you to cover the costs of this claim if you have not made sure that the third party work is cleared. There are certain exceptions. You can use work for private study and research, but that doesn't apply to you because you're working in a commercial context. For quotation, okay, that is mainly also, if you work in a commercial context, you should clear the work. For parody and, comic effects. So some parodies, you might not need to clear rights. But again, if you work in a commercial context, you have to clear the work. If you do something for your own, say, enjoyment and put it up on Facebook and it is a parody, you might get away with not clearing the works in this context. In this context, I would also like you to look at the Intellectual Property Office website. There's a very good resource which is called Copyright Exceptions for Copyright Owners and Creators. So you Google that, Intellectual Property Office, copyright exceptions for owners and creators, something like that. And you will find guidance on this issue on certain exceptions. It's very well written. But again, I mean, from my perspective, it is very well written and understandable. But still, because I'm familiar with the topic, there might still be questions. If you have questions on clearing rights, and clearing means the question, do I have to ask permission if I use third-party work? This is not a question you should answer lightly or just think, okay, I don't quite know, but if in doubt, I use it. You should actually think, I don't quite know. If in doubt, I do not use it, especially when you work in a commercial context, for the reason of the indemnity clause in your contract. Similarly, if your commissioner gives you work, and that I have seen that illustrators, it happens very frequently. I'm not sure if animators have the same problem, but a commissioner gives you work from another illustrator and say, oh, I want something similar. Can you please create something in this style or, something very similar? Try not to do it in this way. Yeah, create your own work and do not work something up from already existing works, because you might be in trouble, especially when the commissioner has not cleared the rights with the original creator of the work they have given you. Yeah, you might be in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. What I was thinking about is if the company says, no, it's okay, we have the rights, blah, blah, blah. Should you get something in writing to say that they're responsible for that? Would that cover you, or because you're creating the work yourself, would that not cover you still?
No, you should, especially when you have your own standard terms and conditions, there should be a clause that they in turn warrant or promise that this work, they have the right to, deal with the work. So when they give it to you, that they have cleared the rights. And this again just shows how important it is that you have your own standard terms and conditions, because you can put in a clause which just says, I will not be responsible for copyright infringement of works you have provided for me to perform this contract.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it's not something that we would think of, but it's definitely, I think animators have a similar thing as illustrators, that people say, oh, I want something in this style, blah, 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 and you don't want to be stepping on anyone's toes, like you said. So I think that's really great advice.
Yeah, I think it's quite important just to protect your own position in the future, even if you're basically not protected if your commissioner tells you that they say vaguely, oh yeah, I think, we can just do something with it. If you suspect in any way that they don't have the rights for you copying the work, which is in most cases the case. Otherwise, they would not commission you, but commission the original creator to do the work. Then in a way, you have to refuse. But it's better to have this clause in your contract, because then you don't have to refuse. But the infringement is in their court, not in yours.
Yeah, that's really great. And we'll put all the links that you mentioned in the show notes as well, so to make it easy for people to find out the information. So what's the biggest takeaway you think that the audience should have from this episode?
Well, I think put stuff in writing. Because if you put what you have just agreed in writing, it just focuses your mind. Even if you write an email to the commissioner saying this and this we have discussed, it just forces you to think about the job and forces you to think about what is missing, including an intellectual property clause.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Like, just everyone try and have contracts in place and put it in writing instead of just relying on verbal agreements.
Yeah.
So I think that was really great. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me again.
Thanks again to Silvia for coming on the show. That was really great. As I said in the intro, we're making a freelance contract bundle specifically for motion designers and animators. So if you want to know more about that, go to motionhatch.com/contract and you'll be notified when that's available, and you'll also receive 10% off. We've also created a free workbook for this episode. So if you go to motionhatch.com/15, you'll be able to download that there. That will just help you remember what you've learnt from this episode and also help you when dealing with your clients and contracts. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. Take care.